Hello everybody and welcome back to another video by Funlearn Tutorials. Now, as we saw in our previous video, when we look at the dynamic version of the specific game that we have considered over here, we find that there is essentially just one solution, which is this solution. This is because both the players are rational and they both try to maximize their profit or utility, and at the end we arrive in this solution, which is capital B and small b. So the player 1 plays capital B and the player 2 plays small b. This is the only possibility. But when we look at this solution, we find that essentially it looks capital B. So there are two solutions that we find from this sort of static representation of the game, which is capital B, and then we have small a, small b, and then we have capital B and small b, small b. So this result, this corresponds to this cell and this result corresponds to this cell. Now the question is, why do we have two results over here, but we actually find out that there is only one result over here? There is some amount of consistency in the two results as well as some amount of inconsistency in the two results. Let me just first change the color of my pen so that I can explain it better. Now, as you can see, what I had explained in the previous video, when you look at the capital B strategies, you essentially look at the second letters. So you look at the B letters. You notice that if you compare capital B and if you consider that the strategy chosen by the first player is actually capital B, that actually matches with small b, which is consistent with the result that we have got here. The inconsistency arises in this part, that is, why is there a small a in the first strategy and small b in the second strategy? Of course, you can understand this is the result that we are looking for, and this is an unrequired result. We do not need this result, but then why is this result coming? The reason for this is that when we consider backward induction essentially eliminates the possibility of non-credible threat. So let me just write down the terminology: non-credible threat. Now what do we mean by a non-credible threat? Let's go back to the strategy that we are trying to remove. So this is the strategy that we are trying to remove from our solution set. BAB. What does BAB mean? When we look at B, that's the single strategy of player 1, so that creates no problem. Let us look at the strategy of the second player, that is small a, small b. Now, as I have mentioned before, what does small a, small b mean? Small a, small b means if player 1 plays capital A, I will look at the first letter, which is small a. But if the first player chooses capital B, I will look at the second letter, which is small b. So this, the organization of the strategies is represented as small a, small b. That is, if the player 1 chooses capital A, I will be choosing this letter, which is small a, as player 2. And if the player 1 chooses capital B, which is his or her second strategy, I will be looking at my second letter, which is small b, where I am the second player. That is the meaning of the letter small a, small b, which is the strategy set. Now, corresponding to this, the strategy that can be explained over here is actually, one is capital A and then small a, so it's this strategy, and then the other strategy is capital B and then small b, which is this strategy. This strategy matches because actually at the end capital B, the player 1 chooses capital B and then player 2 chooses small b. So this strategy matches, which is why I said this part is actually consistent. The second letters are all consistent because that is what actually happens. The inconsistency arises in the first letter. Now, let us think what would have happened if player 1 would have chosen strategy A. If player 1 would have chosen strategy capital A, then player 2 would have actually chosen 2, 4, right? We found out that if player 1 chooses capital A, then player 2 looks at 2 and 4, and he or she compares that 4 is greater than 2, as I have mentioned here. So the player 2 will obviously choose small b. So essentially, if the player 1 chooses capital A, player 2 will have to choose, given that he or she is a rational person, player 2 will have to choose small b. Here, this strategy small a, when player 1 plays capital A, is actually a representation or a manifestation of a non-credible threat. I shall be explaining more on the concept of non-credible threat using another example where the non-credibility of the threat will be apparent. But here what we essentially find out that one outcome gets cancelled out. Now how can we justify this? We can justify this by understanding the difference between an outcome and an equilibrium. What happens is, when we consider backward induction essentially uses the game tree format to find out the outcome. So the backward induction method gives us an outcome. But when we look at this matrix formation, which is the static form of the game, that actually gives us the Nash equilibrium. So the static form gives us the Nash equilibrium, whereas the backward induction method gives us an outcome. This leads to a very beautiful result, which says that all backward inductions are actually Nash equilibrium, because you find that this is the backward induction outcome, and we find this backward induction outcome is also found in this setup. So these two are actually Nash equilibria. So we have two Nash equilibria but one backward induction. So essentially all backward inductions, we can use a Venn diagram to express this. All backward induction are Nash equilibria. So if this is the Nash equilibria and if this is the backward induction outcome, it means that all backward induction outcomes are part of the Nash equilibria, but there exists some Nash equilibria which are not backward induction outcome. What does that mean? This is a Nash equilibrium but not a backward induction, whereas this, as we can find here, is actually both a backward induction as well as a Nash equilibria.